I know some people debate if Rotten Tomatoes is actually a good thing for movie critique, but honestly, while there's definitely some nuance to be had and some context to sort of consider when looking at Rotten Tomatoes, it is actually very handy to just quickly look at it to get a consensus on any particular movie. If I'm thinking I'm going to see two movies at one time, one is at 90% and the other one's at 20%, it's usually a pretty safe bet that the 90%er is the one to go with. That said, sometimes Rotten Tomatoes is wrong. Now, Rotten Tomatoes themselves aren't wrong about anything. All they do is look at all the other reviews that have been posted and put the percentage of which ones are positive. And as dictated in their rules, 60% is the threshold of when a movie is considered fresh. A fresh plum tomato. But movies under that are rotten. Which leads me to my top 10 for today, which is my top 10 movies that are rotten on RottenTomatoes.com. Number 10 is Twins. Now, this starts as something of a trend on this list for some of the entries, because some of these entries are very much movies that I grew up with. And the question of quality might be a little subjective here or there, and there's always the chance that nostalgia is playing an element to this. But this is an Ivan Reitman comedy starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, where they are twins. But of course the joke is they couldn't be more different. I grew up watching this. I grew up watching Arnold movies. This and Kindergarten Cop. Less so Junior, which was the sort of the third pairing between Arnold and Ivan Reitman. But Twins was always, I think, my favourite of the three from a character perspective. Kindergarten Cop is more quotable and might have the more fun premise. But because I also like Danny DeVito, and because both Danny DeVito and Arnold have a lot of charisma, despite the fact that the premise is quite silly, there's an energy to it. There's a nice character study of Danny DeVito being this little shithead who's always conning people, who steals things. And you've got Arnold, who's been raised in an island. He's been vegan his whole life, but now he comes to the mainland and he starts to be corrupted. But he is the influence that Danny DeVito needs, and Danny DeVito likewise lets Arnold loosen up a little bit. And there's a little bit of back and forth between them. Is it a gimmick of a movie? Kind of. It's a gimmicky idea, for sure. Ultimately, I can't help but love every interaction that Arnold and DeVito have in this. They are delightful to watch. Arnold discovering things for the first time, like he's an alien landing on Earth. It's almost like the happy-go-lucky version of a Terminator, where he's not quite human, and his discovery of everything human is just kind of wholesome to watch. At 43%, I feel like that's a bit on the harsh side. I'm not saying this should be celebrated as one of the best cinematic achievements of all time. That'll go for quite a number of things on this list, but 43 does feel a bit harsh. Number 9 is Zombie 2, aka Zombie in the US, aka Zombie Flesh Eaters in the UK. It is a horror movie. Horror movies, well, some of them are considered classics. There are a lot of more cult horror movies, and Zombie 2 definitely falls into that. It's definitely in the upper tier of the cult status, and it is very well known by horror fans, but it's not one that kind of broke out into being a mainstream classic or hit that is talked about whenever there's like a horror documentary or whatever. But Zombie 2 is a really fun movie, really slick Italian music. The scenes of gore and violence really kind of stick out and are very memorable. There's a great scene that involves an eye. There's a legendary fight between a zombie and a shark underwater. Well, obviously it's a shark. Notably, it's a real shark, and they did something very dangerous where they had someone in zombie makeup actually get in the water with, admittedly, a heavily drugged shark, but still super dangerous. Like, it still could have went very wrong. I love how the zombies look in this movie. I love the sense of style in it. It definitely has some of the tropes that are a little bit weak of the Italian zombie knockoff genre. It has the bad dubbing, all the rest of it. You do have to like sort of give into a couple of things, but This is definitely like, once you've knocked out the main classics of the horror genre, if you're dipping into your Lucio Fulci, who directed this film, I think it's one of his best movies. I think it's really slick. It's a style over substance, definitely. The characters aren't anything to write home about. But whenever that music kicks in and we have the slow pulsing and the zombies are like coming towards people on this island, it's hard not to be kind of hypnotized and drawn in by the filmmaking. Number 8, and this will come as no surprise after a recent episode of the Atomic Cinema Experiment, but number 8 goes to Predator 2, which is currently at 30% on Rotten Tomatoes. And look, again, I'm not claiming this is high art, I'm not. But Predator 2 gets a bad rap. Predator 2 is a fun movie with a very exciting cast. You got Bill Paxton, Gary Busey, Danny Glover. It's also hard not to love the use of the urban jungle, the expansion of the Predator's tools and weaponry, some pretty fun set piece moments that really stick out. It's not without its problems, obviously, and it's not it's not this great piece of direction like the first one was. John McTiernan did a fantastic job. Every time I watch Predator 2, I am reminded as to why I like it so much. Like, between the cast and set pieces like the subway stuff, the entire chase sequence, a bit more time with some of the characters I would have liked, but Predator 2 is definitely better than a 30%. Number 7 is another one from my childhood, which I'm going to have to defend here, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original movie, which is sitting at 40% on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm kind of baffled by this a little bit, because I think this first Turtles movie is actually pretty good. And not just in a, I remember liking it as a kid kind of way. I've watched this as an adult, but I am genuinely surprised at how dark this film is. Compared to the cartoon, compared to the later films, it gets emotional in parts. Like, I kind of like how grimy and gritty it all feels. Shredder's a great looking villain. All of that stuff, I think, really adds up. And there's some great stuff when one of the turtles is injured, when they're separated from Splinter. There's a great emotional moment where they're trying to like meditate and communicate with them through meditation, which is obviously a little bit far-fetched. It hits when I watch it, like them getting emotional about it, like, really makes me root for them. I have nostalgia for the second one, but that is a silly kids movie. I don't think the first one is a silly kids movie. I genuinely dig the Ninja Turtles movie, the first one. And number 6 at 29% is Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. I know that this is one I'm going to have to fight people on. Now, this is definitely one that's veering more into my taste of slasher movies and slasher sequels. Obviously, it's nothing compared to the first one, but I have always had a pretty big soft spot for Halloween 4. I like how it flips a few things on its head, even though it's like Michael returning to Haddonfield. The idea that the town remembers the first incident with Michael Myers and that they are prepared for it. The idea that you've got people like immediately believing that he's a real threat, unlike the first movie where no one even is convinced he's around. Donald Pleasance is running around trying to convince the sheriff, but in the fourth movie, they take it seriously immediately. That stuff's really fascinating to me. It kind of works really well as the conclusion of a trilogy, and I know some people think the cliffhanger needs to be followed up on. I actually think the cliffhanger works as a great ending. There's some fun kills, there's some likeable characters, little kid Jamie, her big stepsister, or adopted sister rather, not stepsister. There are some legit complaints to be had. The mask in 4 is not good. Fun sequences, fun kills, a nice kind of play on some of the mythos that came from the original Halloween. Now, did it need expanding on? It didn't. Halloween works as a standalone movie, and I always think it is of that first before I think of it as part of a series where the rest of it's fan fiction. One's the only one that's canon, quite frankly. But if you're going to watch some sequels, watching 1, 2, and 4 is kind of my preferred. Number 5 is Star Trek The Motion Picture, which comes in at 43% currently on RT. Yeah, this one is a bit more baffling to me. We're kind of getting into these movies now where it's less that I like a bad movie or I like something that I think is a bit underrated in some cases, to something that I genuinely really like and do not understand the treatment that this movie gets. Star Trek The Motion Picture for me is in many ways kind of the perfect embodiment of what Star Trek the show was and what I liked about that original series. Star Trek to me wasn't about giant conflict, although it had conflict obviously because stories do, but like it was more about the unknown and the discovery of things. Like some of my favorite episodes of Star Trek the original series where there's something weird out in space in front of us communicating with us or otherwise, and we have to figure out how to communicate or how to protect ourselves or just figure out what the thing is. And Star Trek the motion picture is that. And I think people don't like that it's slow paced. They don't like that it isn't some big conflict. To me, the bigger visual effects and the optical effects and the miniature work and all that stuff that goes into Star Trek the motion picture and elevates it above the stuff that's in the original series. For me, that spectacle and sort of watching that all play out, like, I love Kirk and Scotty taking 5 minutes to get to the Enterprise and just the wonderful Jerry Goldsmith score just basking in the almost the ship porn of the moment. Star Trek the motion picture is obviously skewing. It's obviously not quite as art house or quite as cerebral, but it is definitely skewing towards something like 2001 a lot more than it is to a Star Wars. And that's probably why it didn't do that well at the time, and it's why it took a second chance. And obviously Wrath of Khan was more what people wanted from Star Trek movies at the time, and even now that's what most people prefer. But I love Star Trek the motion picture. I think the beauty of space and the beauty of the journey and the unknown and the debates about how to handle what they're coming up against is exactly the kind of thing that I like about classic Star Trek. Number 4 is the Neon Demon, which is only just making the cut in the sense that it is 59% on Rotten Tomatoes. It is 1% away from fresh. I almost feel bad even including this because it's so close to being fresh. But those are the rules, and this is indeed classed as rotten. This is a hypnotic, dreamlike exploration of what it takes to make it in the glitzy world of the LA modeling scene. And it is Nicholas Winding Refn who directed this. Has a very distinct style, which is not a super mainstream style. He had kind of a mainstream success with Drive, which is a wonderful, wonderful film, but his style tends to skew a bit more art house, a bit more slower paced. It's, if you've seen any of his films other than Drive, and you've seen Only God Forgives, or you've seen his show that was on Amazon, Too Old to Die Young, you'll really get a sense that he loves to bask in quiet moments. He loves to bask with just some nice lighting, some nice slow-paced synth music. He's so good at drawing out those moments and making every beat. And in the same way that some other great directors like David Lynch, directors who can just linger on a moment, but somehow every little thing the actor does that they've been directed to do feels like you're getting something out of the scene and you're being drawn into this journey. It's a very psychological film. It really kind of gets under your skin as the story goes. Characters who are kind of like out to get each other so they can make it. It's a dog eat dog world, all that kind of stuff. And as that plays out, and you start to feel really uncomfortable in some of the situations that our main character is in, it's a fever dream that kind of turns into a nightmare. And it's very affecting. It's a very affecting film which lingers with you after you've watched it. Makes you feel a little bit disgusted, but it leaves you with a feeling. And it is a audio-visual experience which you're definitely been assaulted with the entire time. Right from the first shot, it grabs hold of you and doesn't let go. The fact that this, it's very close, but the fact that this didn't make it to fresh status, maybe it just indicates that Refn is very much a love or hate type of director, but I'm definitely in the love camp. Number 3 is Prince of Darkness, and this is actually just a notch lower than the last one. This is 58% on Rotten Tomatoes, and this is a John Carpenter film from the later part of the 80s. It is about a church which has found a presence, found a being of sorts. A bunch of scientists and other experts come in to try and decipher what the hell this thing is that has an energy reading. What I love most about this movie is just the feeling you get. It is very much about teasing a future, a potential future that this thing is building to. And the way the characters kind of get glimpses of that future the way it's presented to them, and the kind of the build of like hysteria on the outside of the building, and it all feels like it's building and building and building in a way that you know that the world that it's kind of hinting at is not going to be in this movie. The whole point of the movie is that the characters have a chance to kind of stop from ever getting there. The way it treats this kind of potential coming darkness feels very foreboding. And I think, I used the word apocalyptic already, I think, but that is genuinely how it feels. It's one of these things where the style and the overall concept of the movie, I think, carries it so far. I rank this quite highly amongst Carpenter's work, and I know not everyone does. Maybe, you're going to argue it's not Halloween or it's not The Thing. Fair enough. But Rotten? Nah, I ain't buying that. Number 2 is The Barbs with 53%. My boy Joe Dante getting screwed on Rotten Tomatoes. In fact, this is not the only one of his films that I could have potentially put on this top 10. Ultimately, for the sake of variety, I just went with the one. Yeah, The Barbs, starring Tom Hanks, directed by Joe Dante, a bunch of other recognizable faces in it as well, is a simple story set on a cul-de-sac street where some new neighbors move in and they're a bit creepy. And it's kind of about the obsession of Tom Hanks and his friends trying to figure out what the hell's going on in this creepy house, if indeed there is anything creepy going on, or are they just being prejudiced and judgmental. But it's so fun and lighthearted, and it really has that feeling of there's a mystery in the neighborhood. It's a playful film with likable characters. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's definitely something you can watch with, maybe not super young kids, but definitely not. Like, this is not something you're shielding teenagers from. It's a sort of movie that really works well at the end of like a night of movies. Like, if you're watching a bunch of movies, maybe horror movies or serious thrillers or something, you can end your run of movies with something like The Barbs. With any Joe Dante movie, really, because they all kind of have this quality. But, I mean, I hate to say something's just fun, but nothing kind of like epitomizes fun movies to me in the same way that Joe Dante's list of films does. I highly recommend The Barbs, and it's a movie that I feel like most people these days don't know about as much. I would be surprised if anyone watched The Barbs and came out of it thinking it was bad, or didn't like have a happy time and feel like they were entertained and that their time was not rewarded or reward. I would be surprised at anyone having a negative opinion. And in the same way, and I'm not saying it's as good as this, but in the same way that I would be surprised at anyone who doesn't like Back to the Future. Like, how can you not like Back to the Future? I feel the same way about The Barbs. How can you not like The Barbs? And finally, my number 1 rotten movie at 54% is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. I don't know what movie critics watched in 2002 that possessed them to give it enough negative reviews to get this under 60%. This is, out of all the things I checked, out of all the movies I looked up, of all the movies that I liked, that I was checking the scores of to see where they fell, this was the one that shocked me the most. And it was as soon as I got to this one, when I checked this movie, even though I had tons left to check, this was far from the end of my research. As soon as I saw this was rotten, I was pretty sure this was going to be number 1. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is a fantastic film. Maybe if you're a little bit squeamish, not because it's gory, but more because it's really hard hitting. But aside from that, this is just a fantastic film. And I think it is Chan-wook Park, who is the director of this film, who also directed Old Boy, which is part of the same Vengeance trilogy. And I would agree, Old Boy is a little bit better as a movie. The Handmaiden may also be a better movie than Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, although I think I may put Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance above that, if I'm really thinking about it. I think this is easily in his top 3 films, though. I think those are his 3 films, they're his top 3. It's very much a film in 2 halves, and the first half lets you get to know the characters really well, and you're sympathetic towards them, as well the title would imply there's some sympathy involved. And then the second half, you have a character who wants revenge on one of the characters from the first half. You understand every single side of this conflict, but you also know that there has to be consequences for what happens. You feel stuck in that middle position, and it feels, your stomach churns. And I know some people think this film is actually too intense with how it portrays certain things. I think that's wonderful. That's like, oh, I mean, not that film should be so extreme that it turns people off, but to me, this film does make me feel things. Like a lot of Korean films, it does actually do a good job of having some humor in there as well. Although the humor definitely disappears as the film goes on. But because we saw them in these lighter tones, all of a sudden, when you're introduced this more cold revenge and the violent outcomes that are going to be coming, it feels more real because it's not just this dark, violent world we've been in the entire time. There has been these little moments of happiness, and there's this sense of tragedy. There's this sense of like not wanting characters to go through with things, even quite early on, because you feel like it can only lead to something bad. I cannot fathom why this is under 60%. This to me should be comfortably in the 90s. No, never mind scraping above a 60. I cannot fathom it. I cannot. I simply will not. I won't stand for it. But that's my top 10 rotten movies on Rotten Tomatoes. Obviously, all the scores that I told you about are all obviously time of recording, because every so often they will change a little bit. Yeah, obviously there's tons of honorable mentions. There was a bunch of stuff I found that was rotten, some surprising, some not. It took a lot of willpower not to put Shopping Mall onto this top 10. Something like The Fountain, which I'm quite fond of, could have easily made it. The Maniac. Well, actually, both the original and the remake of Maniac are both actually quite good, and both of them are rotten. You know, there's a lot of things that could have made this top 10, but ultimately, I wanted to try and show a mix of taste and a mix of different things, along with just some of the very best things that I feel don't deserve to be rotten. As far as deserving goes, nothing comes close to that number one. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is a phenomenal film, and the idea that it is relegated to not having the tomato is, quite frankly, an insult to good taste everywhere. So screw you, world. Everyone betray me. I am done with this world. To quote another film which I presume is rotten. I never checked, admittedly. I never actually double checked to see if The Room was rotten, but one would imagine that it is. If it isn't, well, they've got a lot to answer for, quite frankly.